Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We saw in our chapter 4 that the first major cause explaining the regular outbreak of wars among states, emphasized by realists, relates to the security dilemma, the feeling of insecurity felt by states. Security dilemma, more specifically, that is to say, the fact that states do never know exactly what other states might do. And this is all the more so true among neighbors. So it's the territorial proximity which increases the security dilemma felt in general by states, and also the nature of weapons in the case of offensive weapons rather than defensive weapons. The security dilemma plays regularly via arms races an immediate role in the outbreak of wars, in the regular outbreak of wars. Realists also emphasize a second factor, power, and more specifically, the distribution of power resources, the systemic distribution of power resources, and, or depending on the theorists, we'll come back, of course, to this, the evolution over time of said distribution, configuration of power resources among major states. The first student, the first scholar, he was a historian, to emphasize, to mention power as a cause for war was Thucydides himself in his famous history of the Peloponnesian War. As a matter of fact, he ascribed the Peloponnesian War to the growth of Athens and the fear which this growth inspired to the people and more specifically to the authorities, the political authorities of Sparta. It is the growth of power of Athens and the fear that it inspired, which is the major cause. Realists agree in referring to Thucydides, but there is no consensus. There is no agreement among realists regarding the interpretation that should be made of this one and the same sentence, that is to say, the growth of power, the growth of Athens' power inspired fear and therefore compelled to some extent Sparta to go to war. More specifically, there are two major, both realist, interpretations of Thucydides. The one is due to David Hume in his political essays, and more specifically in his essay of the balance of power. He proposes an interpretation which is proposed. He was a philosopher during the Enlightenment century, 18th century. He proposed an interpretation that is at the origin of the balance of power theory that represents, that sums up to some extent the first statement in modern times of the balance of power theory. And there is a second interpretation due to Robert Gilpin in his War and Change in World Politics. And Robert Gilpin's interpretation actually sums up the power-cycle theory interpretation of Thucydides. So let's have a look at these two interpretations, and let's start with David Hume. According to David Hume, Thucydides' explanation of the major cause of the Peloponnesian War is at the origin of the balance of power theory. That is to say, according to David Hume, when reading Thucydides, this is what he understood. He understood that before the outbreak of the war opposing Sparta and its allies to Athens and its allies, before the outbreak of this war, both city-states were the most powerful entities in the then Greek or Hellenic world. In other words, there was a balance of power among them. And this balance of power was upset, or ran the risk of being upset because of the growth of power, in this, the growth of Athens' power. The balance then would shift into an imbalance because of the preponderance favorable to Athens. In other words, there was a kind of prospective unipolar structure that the Spartans anticipated, and in order to prevent this imbalance, to occur, they launched a preventive war in order to maintain the existing balance. This is what Hume puts forward in his essay, a short essay of 3-4 pages, Of the Balance of Power. Listen to this, published in 1741. In all the politics of Greece, the anxiety, the fear, with regard to the balance of power is apparent and is expressly pointed out to us by historians, ancient historians. Thucydides, one of them, the most important one, presents the League, the Peloponnesian League, which was formed against Athens. Thucydides presents this league, which produced the Peloponnesian War, as, listen to this, entirely owing to this principle. Sparta formed an alliance called the Peloponnesian League in order to prevent Athens from becoming too powerful, in order to prevent the balanced system to transform into a unipolar one. Once the war over, after the decline of Athens, I go on quoting because you may know that Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, Sparta was the winner. After the decline of Athens, when the city-states of Thebes and Sparta disputed for sovereignty, this is the term used by Hume for sovereignty, I guess he meant for dominance, preeminence. When Thebes and Sparta disputed for sovereignty, we find, I quote, that the Athenians and many other republics, many other city-states, always threw themselves into the lighter scale. That is to say, they joined the coalition of weaker states in order to prevent one of the three states to become too powerful. They endeavored to preserve the balance. The Athenians, after their defeat, joined the weaker powers to maintain the balance with the prospective powerful ones, Thebes and Sparta. They supported Thebes against Sparta until the great victory, after which they immediately went over to the defeated in order to recreate or to maintain the balance. We shall conclude, and this is what I wanted to remember, that the balance of power was sufficiently secured in ancient Greece. The balance of power was sufficiently secured in ancient Greece. Hume, therefore, is at the origin of Thucydides' interpretation of Thucydides, which is at the origin of the balance of power theory. Gilpin proposes a completely different interpretation in his War and Change in world politics. So he considers that Thucydides put forward the first statement of the power-cycle theory. His interpretation is the following one. According to Gilpin, Thucydides described the situation which prevailed in ancient Greece after the wars fought against the Persians, the Persian barbarian. And between the end of the war against the Persians and the beginning of the Peloponnesian League, Sparta, according to his interpretation of Thucydides, Sparta was the prevailing power, the hegemonic power, the leader of the different Greek city-states. In other words, the system at that time was unipolar. And it was stable thanks to the prevailing Spartans. According to Gilpin's reading of Thucydides, it is this hierarchy, this unipolar structure, which the growth of Athens gradually endangered. And Sparta was compelled to go to war in order to prevent Athens from becoming as powerful as itself, in order to prevent Athens from rebalancing the system, in order to prevent Athens from putting an end to unipolarity, in order to prevent Athens to create a kind of bipolar system composed by two major powers. Listen to Gilpin's interpretation. Although Sparta had been the hegemonic power since the end of the wars against Persia, it fell behind as Athens grew. There was a kind of relative decline of Sparta due to the growth of Athens. The Spartan fear ultimately, the Spartan fear of growing Athenian power led to the Great War, led to the war called Peloponnesian War. By launching a preventive war, the declining power destroys or weakens the rising challenger by launching a preventive war, while the military advantage is still with the declining power. The declining power has no interest in waiting too long, because if it waits too long, its resources will be surpassed by the resources of the rising challenger. And therefore, in order to prevent this from happening, the declining power, relatively declining power, has an interest in launching a preventive war. Thus, I go on quoting this last sentence, as Thucydides explained according to Gilpin's reading, thus, as Thucydides explained, the Spartans initiated the Peloponnesian War in an attempt to crush the rising Athenian challenger, while Sparta still had the power to do so. So, absolutely a different interpretation according to Gilpin's reading of Thucydides. The system was unipolar before the war, and the war broke out because of the risk of Athens matching the resources of the relatively declining hegemonic power Sparta. So which then is the good or the right interpretation, and which one is the bad one? Well, it's not easy, of course, to take a decision regarding this opposition. On the one hand, Thucydides himself is somehow ambiguous. He's somehow ambiguous. He permits, in other words, both interpretations. This is what he wrote. Sparta possessed the same form of government for 400 years. It was an aristocratic government. And has been in the position to arrange the affairs of other states. It has been in the position to arrange the affairs of other states, which somehow means that it was prevailing. So here, Thucydides' statement is close to the interpretation given by Gilpin. But then he introduces a new element which somehow proposes another picture of the then prevailing situation. 10 years after the Battle of Marathon, the barbarian Persian Empire returns in order to subjugate Greece. In the face of this danger, due to the Persians' invasion, the command of the Greeks was assumed by Sparta in virtue of its superior power. So we are still in the unipolar world. The Athenians, having made up their minds to abandon their city because of the danger, broke up their homes, threw themselves into their ships, and became a naval people. This coalition, Sparta plus Athens, after repulsing the barbarian, split into two sections. At the end of one stood Sparta, at the end of the other stood Athens. So here, in this last sentence, both city-states are roughly equal because they stand at the head of the two sections, which together prepare the prospective future struggle, war, conflict against Persia. Sparta was the military power, the first military power, and Athens was the first naval power. So here we have a kind of equality. So within one and the same analysis, Thucydides to some extent permits both interpretations. He first claims that Sparta is dominating, but then he proposes a picture which comes very close to a bipolar system, or at least a bipolarized system. I'll come back to the difference in a few minutes. Bipolarized system, that is to say, two alliances, the different city-states joining either Sparta or Athens. So both interpretations are possible, but maybe Hume's interpretation is at the end the one which is closer to Thucydides. Why? Because of Thucydides' very famous Melian dialogue. The Melian dialogue is the dialogue between the generals of the Athenian army preparing themselves to invade, to attack the city-states of Melos. And before attacking and prospectively destroying the city-states, the generals of the army of Athens talked. They established a dialogue with the people living, the inhabitants of the city-state of Melos, and this is what they told them. This is the famous Melian dialogue. You know, as well as we do, you citizens of Melos know as well as we do, it is a shared knowledge, that the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel. The standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel. In fact, and this is what we always remember of this famous Melian dialogue, in fact, the strong do what they have to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. The strong do what they can, and the weak accept what they must. If the strong do what they can, then a unipolar structure with one state stronger than the other one will, by definition, impose its will, including by violent means. And in this case, unipolarity is not favorable to peace, to stability, or to justice. The standard of justice, I quote, depends on the equality of power. Only when there is an equality of power, a bipolar system, just as Hume said when interpreting Thucydides, only when there is a balance of power, justice is possible. The absence, justice, or maybe should we say stability, the absence of war, because no one of the two is likely to impose its will upon the other one. In this case, justice is possible. If there is one who's strong and the other one who's weak, then the strong does what he wants to do, and the weak accepts what he must accept. So both interpretations are possible, but maybe at the end it is Hume's, that is to say, the balance of power interpretation, which is the better. Anyway, there will never be a definitive answer to this question, and what is more important from our perspective here after this class, what is more important are the two realist explanations of why wars break out because of the factor called power. So let's then now look at concretely what the balance of power theory says in the domain of the causes of war and what the power cycle theory claims. Both, I repeat, are realist approaches. So the balance of power theory first is the one that is shared by the majority of realist scholars. Morgenthau, Aron, Waltz, Kissinger, the historian, Mearsheimer, at least until some years ago, all are adherents of the balance of power theory. And according to the balance of power theory, war is likely to break out when there is an imbalance, and or either effectively or anticipated, perceived to be likely to prevail in a more or less faraway future. And conversely, of course, stability. There can be no peace. We are in the realist approach. There are only ceasefires separating the wars of the past from the wars of the future. Stability, therefore, is only possible. Stability defined as absence of any risk of major war. Stability only is possible when there is a balance of power. The starting point of this claim, of this hypothesis, is what Kissinger called the classic lesson of history. In his PhD dissertation, which was published in the book called A World Restored, he analyzed the Vienna Congress in this book, in this dissertation, PhD dissertation. The classic lesson of history, according to Kissinger is the fact that, I quote, no order is safe without physical safeguards against aggressions. No order is safe without physical safeguards against aggression. That is to say, in the case of one state being stronger, there can be no stability. And this idea also is shared by Hadibol, the English school scholar, who in his Anarchical Society quotes a French thinker of the Enlightenment century, the 18th century, Fénelon, and Hadibol goes as far as quoting Fénelon in French. In his English book, he quotes him in French, so I feel free to give you the French original quotation. Il n'est pas permis d'espérer qu'une puissance supérieure demeure dans les bornes d'une exacte modération. It is not possible to expect a major power to behave moderately, a superior power to behave moderately. L'ambition naturelle des souverains, les flatteries de leurs conseillers, la prévention des nations entières ne permettent pas de croire qu'une nation qui peut subjuguer les autres s'en abstienne pendant des siècles. A nation, a state, a unit, able to subjugate the other ones thanks to its superior resources, will not stop short from doing so over the long run. Sooner or later, it will be tempted to subjugate the weaker unit. In other words, stability is only possible when there is a balance of power. That is to say, when there is a roughly equal amount of power resources possessed by the different states concerned. David Hume proposed the following definition of the balance of power. The balance of power exists when no state is able to control as much force, to possess as many resources, sorry, I repeat. Stability exists when no state is able to control as much force as to incapacitate the other states from defending their rights against it. I repeat, the balance of power exists when no state is powerful enough to impose its will upon other states so that these other states can no longer defend their rights against said state. Why, according to realists, should such a balance of power be stability prone, be favorable to stability, not to mention peace? Why? Because if state A knows that state B roughly possesses the same amount of resources, and if state B knows that state A roughly possesses the same amount of forces, both hardly can bet on an easy victory if they decided to go to war. The expected utility of going to war is not likely to be positive. You cannot expect that it will be easy for you to defeat someone if roughly this adversary possesses the same amount of military and also economic capacities. The expected utility of going to war is low, according to this analysis, in the case of a balance of power. And if you cannot rationally expect to easily win a war, what will you do? In the case of a conflict in the strict meaning, in the neutral meaning of divergent aspirations and interests, what do? You look for peaceful conflict resolution means, of course. You prefer dialogue, you prefer cooperation, you prefer negotiations rather than going to war. Conversely, when a state is powerful, superior to other ones, it is tempted to profit from this superior power in order to behave aggressively. And in the case of a power which is perceived by the other ones to be likely to become too powerful, then these other ones are incited to wage a war in order to prevent the prospective too powerful state to become too powerful. Okay? The risks of war are higher, in other words, when there is an imbalance of power, either effective or perceived, anticipated in the future. And these risks of war increase because of the objective power resources of potentially one state. And whatever the intentions of this state, a state which is powerful compared to other ones, a state which possesses more power resources, more military resources than the other ones, whatever its intentions, whatever its moderate intentions, it will, by the mere fact of existing, increase the risks of war because the other ones, the weaker ones by definition, or the potentially weaker ones, cannot but expect an aggressive behavior, whatever the intentions, whatever the discourses proclaimed by the prospectively powerful state. Because if they trust these discourses or these somehow peaceful intentions, they run the risk, of course, of the most powerful state cheating, profiting from this kind of naive belief. Listen to David Hume. The prevailing power incites the other states to form an alliance against it, however moderate it may be in the exercise of its authority. However moderate the behavior of the prevailing state, the other states cannot afford to accept such an imbalance. They will create join an alliance or create an alliance in order to put an end to the imbalance, because only balance permits stability to prevail and therefore their own security to be somehow guaranteed. So this is the general statement put forward by the balance of power theory. This general statement, this agreement, this consensus, however, regarding the basic claim of the theory, does not mean that all the theorists concerned agree upon the most efficient type of balance of power system, of balanced system. They do not agree upon which of the multipolar or the bipolar system is more likely to be stability prone, or more likely, by deduction to some extent, to nevertheless favor instability. Indeed, when we look at the concrete historical record, there are two types of concretely existing systems that can be considered to be balanced systems: the multipolar one and the bipolar one. In the multipolar system, you know that there are at least three major states. These great states possess roughly the same amount of military and economic capacities. A bipolar balance, by definition, is composed by two major powers. These two major powers dominate all the other ones, and these other ones, therefore, somehow have to join either one or the other of the two major powers. This distinction is easy at first sight, but once again, in the historical reality, it's not that easy. It's not that easy. Or not always. For instance, at the end of the 19th century, there were 5 or 6 major powers: Great Britain, France, Russia, unified Germany, Austria, and maybe Italy. So the system is bipolar. It's multipolar, sorry. The system is multipolar, of course. But you know that World War I broke out and it deposed two coalitions: the Triple Entente, France, the UK, Russia, to the Triple Alliance, Austria, Germany, Italy. So 6 major powers, but 2 alliances. So was the system multipolar or bipolar? Frank Wayman, if you look at the bibliography, ladies and gentlemen, Frank Wayman proposed a difference between what he calls power polarity and cluster polarity. Power polarity refers to the number of major powers, the structure of the system. Cluster polarity refers to the possible organization of this structure into alliances or coalitions. And therefore, the eve of World War I was a system which was multipolar regarding the power polarity, and it was bipolarized regarding the cluster polarity, because the six major powers, what did they do? They did join two different alliances. So the multipolar structure was committed in a kind of bipolarization process. And if we generalize this idea, there can be as many pure systems as there can be hybrid or mixed system. A pure system, for instance, according to the theorists agreeing with the general balance of power theory. A pure system, the example of a pure system is the Peloponnesian War. Two major powers, so the system was bipolar. Sparta, Athens. And two alliances. So the system was bipolar and bipolarized because all the other Greek city-states joined either Sparta, the League of the Peloponnesian League, or Athens, the League of Delos. And another example of a pure system was the system of, for instance, the 17th or 18th century, purely multipolar system, because there were 3, 4, 5 major powers, France, Spain, and the Austrian Habsburgs, England, Prussia, etc., Russia. And there were shifting alliances. That is to say, there was no bipolarization process. And then we have mixed or hybrid systems, the eve of World War I, multipolar power polarity, but bipolarized cluster polarity, and maybe to some extent, the second half of the Cold War. The second half of the Cold War, we had two major powers, the US and the USSR. But to some extent, at least, de Gaulle, for instance, practiced a somehow autonomous foreign policy within the Western camp. Notably, he decided that France should no longer be part of the unified military command of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And China, in the Eastern camp, in the Soviet camp, no longer remained loyal to the Soviet Union from the mid of the 60s onwards. So maybe the system was bipolar regarding the structure, but somehow a bit, according to these theorists or historians, but somehow committed into a multipolarization process because of the behavior of some allies within the two camps. So these distinctions are somehow useful to give precise, detailed descriptions of a historical situation, but regarding what regards the theory and what regards the analysis of the causes of war, the majority and actually everybody, with the exception of women, focuses on merely power polarity. So they look at, are purely bipolar or are purely multipolar systems more stable prone or more war prone than the other one? Which one is likely to permit stability to prevail rather than to permit wars to break out? The majority of realists, ladies and gentlemen, that is to say Morgenthau plus Kissinger plus Raymond Aron, prefer the multipolar balance, the multipolar system as being considered, they consider it to be more stability prone. Kenneth Waltz is the most important realist scholar, neo-realist. This is a secondary point for this problematic. Kenneth Waltz considers bipolar systems to be more stability prone than multipolar system, and he was joined at least during some years by Merschala. So let's look at the arguments put forward by the ones and the others. According to realists, favorable to multipolarity as a peace-prone or stability-prone system, of course. The advantages of a multipolar system are the following ones. First of all, a multipolar system is, a multipolar balance is flexible, is fluid. There are no rigid alliance patterns by definition because there are shifting alliances that are practiced. So a state is neither eternal friend nor perpetual enemy. Today's friend may become tomorrow's enemy. Today's adversary may become tomorrow's ally. Everything depends on the national interest that the different states pursue. And therefore, there is a kind of general uncertainty. Nobody knows exactly what the other state may do. Will it remain a loyal friend, or will it become a traitor, or will it join the alliance of the enemy, etc., etc. So if you do not know exactly what the other states will do, you are, according to these theorists, you are incited to behave prudently. You will have a cautious, a tendency to behave cautiously, prudently. In other words, you should be incited to look for peaceful solutions because you do not know exactly what the other states will do in the case you will be tempted to go to war. And the second argument of the multipolar theorists is that by definition in a multipolar system there are at least three major powers, at least three, pretty often 4, 5, 6. What does that mean? There is no risk of a rigid opposition between two major powers since there are 3, 4, 5 ones. And what's more, when there are 3, 4, 5 major powers, there is always a risk. There is always a risk. There's always a chance, sorry. There's always a chance for one state to accept to play the role of an arbitrator, of a mediator. That is to say, in the case of a kind of somehow rigid opposition emerging between two of the 3, 4, 5 major powers, then one of the remaining powers is likely to propose a mediation process which logically should contribute to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. These arguments, of course, are rejected by adherents of the bipolar balance thesis. First of all, the first argument put forward by bipolarity theorists is the following one. If there are 3, 4, 5 major powers, the equality, the roughly equal amount of power resources among these powers is much more difficult to obtain than when there are only two. And mathematically speaking, this seems obvious. It's easier to obtain twice 50% than 5 times 20%. When there are major powers, it is likely that one power possesses 20, but the other one 30, the other only 15, the other 10, etc., etc. When there are only two, it's easier that both probability that both control 50% is higher than 5 states possessing roughly all around 20% of the military resources. And the second argument of the bipolar theorists consists in saying that the more there are great powers, so they criticize the multipolar thesis, the more there are great powers, the more there are potentially divergent demands, divergent aspirations. And logically then, the more different divergent demands there are, the higher is the possibility for conflicts to break out. So these critiques of the multipolar thesis logically put forward the advantages that they consider to be the advantages of bipolarity. And this is known to be the case of Kenneth Waltz, who added in his Theory of International Politics an article that he had published during the 60s, which this article was called The Stability of a Bipolar World, the Stability of a Bipolar World. So according to Kenneth Waltz, and of course, he's influenced by the then stability of the Cold War, which did not escalate into a hot war, though it was not a peaceful period either, of course. But from our perspective here, remember how we define war and peace in our introductory chapter. Peace is merely the absence of violent interaction. So according to Kenneth Waltz, influenced by the then fairly stable Cold War system, which was a bipolar one, according to the balance of power theorists. We will see a bit later that according to unipolar theorists, Gilpin, the Cold War actually was unipolar. So there is absolutely no consensus among realist international relations scholars. So according to Kenneth Waltz, in a bipolar system, one first advantage is that the two major powers have interest everywhere in the world by definition, since they control roughly half the world. So what do? They will, of course, very severely, very strictly control what all the allies will be doing. And if they control what all the allies will be doing, there is no risk of a conflict starting from the behavior of the third-party states. Which amounts to saying, it's the second argument, very complementary, of course. Both superpowers, the only worry that they have is to know what the other one will do. So they can focus on perceiving, anticipating the main adversary's behavior. In other words, there are much lesser risks of misperceptions in the case of two major powers, bipolarity, than in a multipolar system. Because in a multipolar system, the risks of misperception increases with the number of major states. If one state has to perceive correctly 2, 3, 4, 5 potential adversaries, misperceptions are more likely to shape its decisions, with the risk of war increasing. Remember what we saw in chapter 2, misperceptions as a cause for war. And the last argument of Kenneth Waltz is when there are two major powers, the behavior of secondary powers is somehow insignificant. Because by definition, these secondary powers, being members of the alliance of one of the two major powers, are weaker, significantly weaker than the two major powers. So when, in the case of an ally leaving the alliance, since the majority of the power resources are in the hands of the major power, the leader of the alliance, the fact for one secondary power to leave, even to join the other alliance, does not have a significant impact upon the overall balance, because the balance is dependent on the two powers exclusively. The stability of the system, therefore, is not affected by a potential betrayal of one of the secondary powers. These arguments, once again, are rejected by multipolar theorists. They claim that since major powers, two major powers in the bipolar world, have interests everywhere in the world, the smallest conflict, the smallest divergence in any part of the world is likely to escalate into a major conflict, because of the necessity for the two major powers to intervene, to guarantee, to satisfy, and to defend their interests in every part of the world. And of course, the multipolar theorists also claim that when there is no third-party state, by definition, since there are only two major powers, when there is no third-party state, there is no state likely to propose a mediation, to propose a negotiation. And therefore, peaceful conflict resolution is less likely, because there are only two major powers who cannot but rely on their military capacities. So the debate is somehow never-ending, and the bipolar theorists reject the multipolar arguments and vice versa. What does the empirical record say? The empirical record, as usual, is sometimes favorable to the multipolar theorists, and sometimes, depending on the historical periods that are chosen. I repeat that in social sciences, there is never one single theory likely to be corroborated by all the existing empirical events, by all the existing empirical cases. So, multipolar theorists, Morgenthau, Aron, Kissinger, claim that bipolarity is war-prone, and the example they give, of course, is Sparta and Athens. There were two major powers, and the Peloponnesian War broke out. And so this is a negative corroboration. And they have a positive corroboration. According to them, the 19th century, the long 19th century, 1815, 1914, was peaceful or stable, thanks to multipolarity. There were four, five, six major powers. You know them. I mentioned them: Great Britain, France, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Germany to some extent. Adherents of the bipolar balance, of course, have their historical corroborations. According to them, the multipolar system of the 19th century was maybe peaceful throughout the 19th century, but it did not prevent World War I from breaking out. They also claim that the interwar period between 1980 and 1939, the 20 years period or 20 years crisis of Edward Kahn, this period was multipolar. The US, the USSR, Germany, Italy, the UK, France, Japan. So 7 major powers, and the system ended up in World War II. And their positive example is bipolarity. The bipolarity of the Cold War. The Cold War was bipolar, according to them. And no war broke out, no hard war broke out between the US and the USSR. So it is impossible to claim that multipolar theorists are corroborated empirically by existing historical record, but it's also impossible to say that bipolar theorists are right or wrong. So how can we get out of this kind of deadlock to some extent? I propose the following solution. I do consider to some extent both to be wrong. I consider both multipolar and bipolar theorists to be wrong, because I do prefer the power cycle theory. I do consider the power cycle theory to be both empirically corroborated, at least more often than the balance of power theory, be it the multipolar balance of power or be it the bipolar balance of power. And I also consider that the power cycle theory, claiming that there is unipolarity, and that unipolarity is more favorable to stability, I think it is also logically more coherent within the realist approach than the balance of power theory. I'll come back to this later. I will start my argumentation by, to some extent, proving negatively that both multipolar theorists and bipolar theorists were empirically refuted by their predictions, by their own predictions of what the Cold War would end up in. Let's have a look at the predictions that were made in the 70s by both multipolar theorists and bipolar theorists regarding the future of the Cold War. Raymond Aron, in his Peace and War, in the preface of the last edition that was published in 1984, but it was written in 1982, he died in 1983. Aron is favorable to multipolarity as a stable, prone system. He's favorable to multipolarity because he considers bipolarity to be war-prone. And this is what he wrote: a bipolar system may not, so at the beginning he's ambiguous, may not as such be more unstable or more belligerent than the multipolar system, but it is more seriously threatened by a generalized war. A bipolar system is more seriously threatened by a generalized war. There is a risk of a generalized war breaking out, in other words, between the US and the USSR. Indeed, I go on quoting, if all the political units belong to one camp or the other, any kind of local conflict in the third world. Any kind of local conflict concerns the whole of the system. Lacking a third man, the arguments that I put forward some minutes ago, lacking a third man, a third party, either arbitrator or contributor, the two great powers are perpetually in conflict, either directly or through intermediaries. Since they have interests everywhere in the world, sooner or later, these interests will end up in provoking a major war, a generalized war. So bipolarity is likely to end up, to result in a major war between the two major powers and their allies. Waltz was an adherent, he died in 2013. His book was published in 1979. Waltz was an adherent of the peace through bipolarity thesis, or stability actually, through bipolarity thesis. And these are his arguments: the simplicity of relations in a bipolar world, and the strong pressures that are generated from everywhere in the world. So it's exactly the opposite argument. The simplicity of the relations in the bipolar world and the strong pressures that are generated make the two great powers conservative. They will behave prudently. The US and the USSR. Like other duopolists, two poles of powers, in other fields, in the fields of economy, when two major firms control a market. You know that the neo-realist approach of Kenneth Waltz consists in applying economic methods to international relations theory. The USA and the USSR, like duopolists in other fields, are learning gradually how to cope with each other. They are learning how to cope with each other. That is to say, they are smart enough not to go to war. The system is stable. So they have this divergent analysis of the instability or stability of the Cold War. But they have one common point: they were unable to predict the end of the Cold War, or they were unable to predict the concrete end that the Cold War would take. Aron indeed predicted a violent end of the Cold War. Since the bipolar system is likely to favor the outbreak of a generalized war, he considers that there is a high risk, I quote, "It is almost inevitable that this generalized war will become an ideological one." So he expected in 1982, 1983, during the last preface to the last edition during his lifetime of Peace and War, he predicted a generalized ideological war opposing the Soviets to the Americans. Waltz predicted exactly the opposite. Since he emphasized the stability of the Cold War, he came to the conclusion that this stability would be very, very long lasting. Great powers are strong not simply because they have nuclear weapons, but also because their immense resources enable them to generate and maintain power of all types. So not merely nuclear power, but also military power and other at strategic and tactical levels. And listen to this. This is his forecast. The barriers to entering the superpower club have never been higher and more numerous. The barriers to entering the superpower club have never been higher and more numerous. The club, the superpower club, will long remain the world's most exclusive one, the world's most exclusive one. Only two members, and this will last pretty long, the US and the USSR. You know that 10 years after his prediction, published in 1979, in 1989, no more Cold War. The USSR collapsed definitely 2 years later in 1991. And the superpower club was composed only by one and no longer by two. So the long-lasting superpower club composed by two major powers lasted 10 years. So Waltz is refuted. The Cold War came to an end. This is what Aron had predicted. The Cold War came to an end, but Aron had predicted a violent end, a generalized ideological war. The problem, unfortunately for Aron, is that the end that came, the end of the Cold War was anything but violent. Not one single fire shot occurred. Not one single gun was used. So Aron was refuted too, because of the peaceful end that he, and actually nobody else, never imagined, conceived, predicted. I was a student in the 1980s. None of my teachers predicted the end of the Cold War, and all the less so the peaceful end. We all were surprised when it arrived. So if then both multipolar theorists and bipolar theorists are wrong, or at least were unable to predict, and since they claim that prediction is part of social sciences, I'm afraid they are refuted. So if they are refuted, then we have to look for another theory. Waltz implicitly on page 179, to some extent, imagines that things might occur the way they did occur. Listen to this. The Soviet Union, when he describes the Soviet Union, when he comes to the conclusion that maybe the Soviet Union is not that powerful, the Soviet Union enjoys many of the advantages that the US has. Then, listen, with half of our GDP, with half of our gross domestic product, the USSR nevertheless has to run hard to stay in the race. So he expects to some extent that the USSR will no longer be able to match America's resources. One may think that the question you ask is not whether a third or fourth country will be able to enter the cycle of great powers, the superpower club, in the foreseeable future. Maybe the question to ask is whether the USSR can keep up. Whether the USSR can keep up. And indeed, 10 years later, the USSR did not keep up, was unable to go on representing a somehow credible challenge, militarily speaking, to the US. And therefore it collapsed, and therefore the Cold War came to an end. So if the Cold War came to an end, if neither Waltz explicitly nor Aron predicted the peaceful end of the Cold War, then we have to look for another theory. And this other theory, logically, is the power-cycle theory. The power-cycle theory, or the power-cycle theories, because there are various versions of the power-cycle theory. I will focus on Gilpin. War and Change in World Politics. I will merge Gilpin's War and Change in World Politics, his hegemonic war theory, with the so-called power transition theory. The power transition theory is the one that had been proposed as early as in the 1950s by another American scholar, Kenneth Organsky. His theory is called the power transition theory. I put it together, I merged it into one single framework together with Robert Gilpin's hegemonic war theory. So this theory is shared by a minority of contemporary realist scholars, but in the past, historians, at least implicitly, put forward the same analysis. This is the case of Edward Gibbon, the Scottish historian of the Enlightenment century, in his analysis of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. This is the case also with Montesquieu, Grandeur et Décadence de l'Empire Romain, ou des Romains, I don't remember the exact title. This is the case also of Paul Kennedy, the contemporary British historian, in his book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. So these theorists are realists. So the starting point is logically the fact, the hypothesis that international relations take place in an anarchical setting. The structure of international relations is anarchical. However, and here immediately we have the difference. This anarchical structure does not exclude a hierarchical power distribution. Though no central authority above states, though there is no central authority above states, one state will end up becoming more powerful than the other ones. So the power distribution, the configuration of power resources among the different powers will be favorable to one single power. So there is a de facto hierarchy, which amounts to saying that the distribution of power, and therefore the structure, is unipolar. rather than bipolar or multipolar. There is one dominant state on top of the system. This power is on top of the system because it has superior resources, notably material resources. Realists focus on material resources, economic richness, demographic variables, the number of population and the skillness of populations, and of course military capabilities. Thanks to these resources, the major power, the prevailing, the preeminent, the hegemonic power, manages the systems peacefully. Most of the time, the international system, thanks to unipolarity, is stable. It is stable thanks to the different international institutions that the major power establishes. Because these international institutions, of course, are favorable to its own interest. The major power is egoistic like any power. But it is a kind of a smart egoism or long-run egoism because the major power associates the secondary powers to the benefits of the system. Or at least it associates those powers that accept the status quo to the benefits of the system. These secondary powers accepting the status quo are called satisfied powers. And by definition, a satisfied state does not try to change the system. Its behavior, therefore, will be peaceful. There are, nevertheless, dissatisfied secondary powers, which are called revisionist states. And they potentially are likely to challenge the system because they do not want to follow the rules, the institutions established by the major power together with the satisfied state. These dissatisfied states, the revisionist states, are challengers, likely to become challengers, and they are called by Organsky, this is Organsky's contribution, they are called contenders. They are called contenders when their resources reach the threshold of 80% of the prevailing powers, material and actually economic richness. 80% of the prevailing powers GDP. In this case, the challenger is called contender. So stability prevails most of the time. Most of the time, thanks to the majority of satisfied states, and those conflicts that nevertheless do arise, of course, those conflicts that nevertheless arise, those conflicts are most of the times regulated peacefully within the institution. Sometimes, however, local, regional, limited military operations are necessary to prevent the local troublemaker, regional troublemaker from upsetting a regional order. And the best example, of course, we can give is Operation Desert Storm, the first war America fought against Saddam Hussein in 1990-1991. The regional troublemaker, Saddam Hussein, upset by invading Kuwait, the regional order, the oil market stability, and America, with the UN resolution, but this is another dimension which is not directly related to today's topic. America intervened militarily to maintain, to permit the stability to be maintained. So most of the times, stability is managed by peaceful conflict resolution, sometimes by limited resorts to weapons. However, by definition, the system cannot be eternally, perpetually stable. It cannot be eternally stable because sooner or later there will be a kind of relative decline of the prevailing power. And this relative decline, relative compared to the rise of other states, of course, this relative decline is due to two major mechanisms. The first mechanism is an economic one. It's the economic law of uneven growth. The economic law of uneven growth. That is to say, by definition, the prevailing power was the first one to enter the growth cycle. And being the first to enter the growth cycle, it will also be the first, according to this approach, to confront a slowing down of the growth rate. It goes on in absolute terms increasing its economic riches, but in relative terms, the speed of the increase will slow down. And of course, while its own growth rate is slowing down, the growth rate of the secondary powers, who by definition entered the growth cycle later than the first one, their growth rate is booming. So we come sooner or later to a growth rate which permits the secondary power to come close to the resources of the first. And this economic mechanism will be doubled by a strategic one, a military strategic one, what these theorists, and notably Paul Kennedy, call imperial overstretch. Imperial overstretch. That is to say that the prevailing power, there's only one, of course, in order to go on profiting from the existing order, which by definition profits its interest, benefits its interest, prevailing power must maintain this order, which amounts to saying that it must sometimes intervene militarily to prevent the regional troublemakers, and I would say, to upset regional orders, to maintain its credibility as a prevailing power, a policeman of the world, if you want. So what does this concretely mean? This means concretely that the prevailing power must dedicate a significant part of its richness to military spendings, and these military spendings will not be dedicated to improving its economic growth. The secondary powers, however, have no such responsibilities on the world political stage. They can dedicate 100% of their richness to still go on improving and therefore accelerating their economic growth rate. So this second strategic mechanism adds its impact to the impact of the slowing down of the growth rate of the law of uneven growth. And together then, sooner or later, one secondary power will reach the threshold of 80% of the still prevailing but relatively slowly declining major powers' resources. Over time, in other words, the system will no longer be unipolar. It will be characterized by parity. Parity is the term used and not balance, because power-cycle-theorists do not agree with the balance of power theorists, and therefore they do not use the term balance by definition. Balance for balance of power theorists is synonymous with stability. Parity, equality, for power cycle theorists is synonymous with increased risks of war by definition. If peace or stability, to be more precise, more rigorous, if stability prevails as long as there is a gap between the unipolar and the secondary powers, if there is no more gap, if there is parity, equality, parity, then by definition there can be no more stability. So parity, therefore, parity phase, therefore, is a war-prone period. A parity phase, which is a war-prone period, is called transition period. Transition period, the power transition theory of Organsky. Why? Because it is a transition period because the stable system of the past and the prospective stable system of the future, which is not there yet, but which is supposed to arrive, is likely to arrive a little bit later. So in a transition period, therefore, the risks of war are high. They are high by definition if the rising challenger, which becomes a contender, is a dissatisfied, a revisionist state. In the case of a rising challenger being a satisfied state, in this case, a peaceful transition is conceivable, is imaginable. But in the case of the rising challenger being a dissatisfied revisionist contender, then there is a very high risk of war, and such a war between the rising power and the still hegemonic but slowly declining power, relatively declining power. The risk of such a war exists because of, once again, two possible mechanisms. Such a war can break out directly or indirectly. It can break out directly because of the preventive motivation for war of the still prevailing power. The still prevailing power, in order to stop the rise of the challenger, may be tempted to launch a preventive war. Preventive war, that is to say, a war launched before it will be too late to fight a war, since the circumstances will be no longer that favorable. By definition, if you wait too long, the rising challenger will profit from the period to go on increasing its resources. And to some extent, by definition, if the declining power waits too long, it will go on declining. So it would be absolutely foolish to wait, because to wait means to wait too long, and it will be too late to stop the challenging powers rise. And according to Gilpin, this is what happened. In ancient Greece, it is the fear felt by Sparta that the growth of Athens might permit Athens to become too powerful, which incited, which convinced, which compelled, to some extent, the leaders of Sparta to launch the preventive war, which then escalated into the Peloponnesian War. The war, however, also can occur, second mechanism, it can occur indirectly because of the aggressive behavior of the rising challenger. The rising challenger, of course, is impatient. It can, of course, see that it is growing, etc., but it is not yet recognized as the major power. So it may be tempted to accelerate the rise, the course of history. And in order to do so, what may be tempted to do, it might adopt an aggressive behavior in its immediate neighborhood against neighbors. These neighbors, however, appeal by definition to the still hegemonic power in order to be protected. So the hegemonic power is compelled to intervene to maintain its credibility, to maintain the regional order threatened by the aggressive behavior of the rising contender. So an initially local war opposing the rising contender to regional opponents, to regional adversaries, this initially local or regional conflict escalates into a major war because of the intervention that the still prevailing power must stage in order to try to maintain the system, in order to try to appear credible in the eyes of its allies in the region and beyond the region. And this is what happened according to Gilpin in 1914 and in 1939. Hitler in 1939, Wilhelm II, the William II, the German Emperor in 1914, behaved aggressively in the neighborhood. William II supported Austria against Serbia. Hitler invaded, of course, first Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and eventually Poland, and Great Britain in 14 and in 39 could not but declare war to Germany in order to stop this aggressive behavior, in order to try to maintain what is still perceived wrongly, but is another question, as being the British order. So the war which then breaks out is a hegemonic war. It is called the hegemonic war, and therefore the name given to Gilpin's theory is the hegemonic war theory. What is a hegemonic war? It is a war which, whatever its immediate triggering causes, and whatever also the intentions of the belligerents, it is a war which is at the origin of a new system, of a new stable system, of a new hierarchical unipolar system, with a new hegemonic power maintaining the order, the stability of said system. I quote the definition of Gilpin, of the hegemonic war by Gilpin, inspired by Aron, a short book in the 1950s, War and Industrial Society, La guerre et la société industrielle. It was published in 1957, as far as I remember. So hegemonic war is a war, in guerre d'hégémonie is the term of Aron. It is a war that determines which state will be dominant, and will govern the system. Which state will govern the system? Govern in the meaning of ruling, not in the strict meaning of government. There is no government. So according to Gilpin, this state, which will be the new hegemonic power, will not be the rising contender, because the rising contender will be defeated by the coalition of satisfied states led by the still hegemonic but relatively declining hegemonic power. Athens was growing in ancient Greece, it was defeated. Imperial and then Nazi Germany were growing, but they were defeated by the coalition of major powers. So who then will be the new prevailing power? It will be either a third-party state. This is what happened in Greece. It is Macedonia that profited from the exhaustion of both Athens and Sparta. Athens lost, Sparta won, but Sparta was weakened by the war. Although also it was in relative decline by definition due to the rise of Athens. And it was Macedonia of Philip, and then of course of Alexander the Great, created his empire a bit later. So a third party state is profiting, or it is the most powerful, the richest, economically speaking, ally within the coalition of the satisfied powers, which will become the new prevailing power. And this was the case in 45, when the richest power of the coalition of anti-German and anti-Japanese allies, that is to say the US, became the new preeminent power. Great Britain was no longer powerful enough to go on maintaining what had been the British order of the 19th century. So to sum up the power cycle theory, according to the power cycle theory, wars break out when there is a parity or transition phase. Stability is likely to prevail when there is, and as long as there is unipolarity, a huge gap between the prevailing power one, and the different secondary powers. So the power cycle theory is as realist as the balance of power theory, but it has its specificities. It is taking into account the evolution over time, so it's of the power configuration, of the power distribution. So it's a kind of dynamic theory, whereas the first one is much more static. It takes a picture. It takes a picture of at one moment. The power cycle theory makes a movie. It takes into account the evolution of time. This is one difference. There is a second difference. The power cycle theory is not purely material. That is to say, it takes into account the degree of satisfaction of states. It takes into account whether states, whatever their material richness or their material military power resources, it takes into account the fact that they are or not satisfied with the status quo. So there is a kind of non-material, close to subjective element. Intentions are taken into account and not merely objective resources. Remember what David Hume said? A prevailing power, whatever its intentions, however moderate its intentions, will scare the other powers. This is not what power cycle theorists would say. They say that a prevailing power, this contributes to explain why a unipolar order is stable. Since the prevailing power behaves moderately, by definition, since it associates secondary power to the benefits of the system, its intentions are not perceived to be hostile. And since its intentions are not perceived to be hostile, the secondary powers satisfy with the existing order. So the intentions, the perception of all the states, of the other states' intentions, are as important as the material distribution of power resources. And this is all the more so true if we look at secondary powers. The secondary powers that are rising, if they are satisfied and perceived to be satisfied by the still prevailing power, their rise is not considered to be threatening. It is only when the rising power is dissatisfied, revisionist, perceived to be eager to change the system, that the somehow relatively declining power feels threatened and is tempted to wage a preventive war, etc., etc. So these differences are somehow important. And the last difference regards the basic underlying reason why either war or either stability is likely to prevail. This basic reason is the level of uncertainty felt by states. According to multipolar theorists, stability is likely to prevail in the multipolar balance because of the uncertainty felt by all the states. No state can be sure of whatever other third, fourth, fifth major power is likely to do. Since you do not know what the other one will do, you will behave prudently. Bipolar theorists claim the opposite. There are only two powers, so the uncertainty is lower because one power only needs to know what the other one will do. So there is lesser uncertainty because there is a small number of states. And in the power-cycle theory, there is absolutely no uncertainty to some extent. There is a perfect certainty of what the other states will do. The most powerful states know that the secondary powers are too weak to challenge the system. And the secondary powers know that they are too weak to try to successfully challenge the system. So everybody knows exactly what the other may be tempted to do on the basis of their material resources, and also, we said this 2 minutes ago, on the basis of their perceived intentions. So to some extent, the unipolar theory takes the bipolar theory to its logical end, to its logical conclusion. Since for bipolar theorists such as Kenneth Waltz, the Cold War was stable because both the US and the USSR knew roughly, precisely, exactly what the other one would do. They were certain of what the other might be tempted to do. The unipolar theorists, by claiming that in the case there is only one power, all the powers know exactly what will happen, to some extent, the power-cycle theory is logically more coherent than the bipolarity, since both disagree with the multipolar theory. This, if you accept my interpretation, a greater logical coherence also exists when we compare the balance of power theory on the one hand and the power-cycle theory on the other hand, when we compare both to them to the general, broader realist framework. You know that the first modern philosopher of realism was Thomas Hobbes. You know that in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, the state of nature among men, applied to the state of nature or of anarchy among states, is a never-ending state of war. Why was the state of nature among men a state of war among men? Because men are jealous, because they are driven by the will to dominate, etc. They are egoistic, they are aggressive. But also, I quote, because nature has made men so equal. Nature has made men so equal in the faculties of body, physical strength, and in the faculty of mind. There is an equality among men. From this equality arises equality of hope in attaining our objectives. We all can hope that we will be successful in trying to obtain what we are looking for, since we are as strong, roughly, as all the other ones and as smart as all the other ones. From this equality of ability arises equality of hope in attaining our ends. Therefore, listen to this, therefore, if two men desire the same thing, which they cannot both enjoy, if two men desire the same thing they nevertheless cannot both enjoy, they become enemies because they are as strong and as smart. In the way to their end, in the way to obtain satisfaction, they endeavor to destroy one another. So if men go to war against each other because they want to obtain the same thing they cannot both enjoy, and since they go to war because roughly they are equally strong and equally intelligent, then equality is not favorable to stability. By definition, equality is not favorable to stability. Now, Thomas Hobbes considers that states, I quote, are but artificial men. States are but artificial men. So what is true for men will be true for states. So states that are equal in resources will not live in stability because they can hope to achieve the same end, which they cannot both enjoy at the same time. So if two or more than two states roughly possess the same equal amount of military and economic resources, then within the general realist approach, beyond the mere balance of power versus power cycle theories, if this is the case, then stability will not be favored by equality or by balance. Balance or equality, and actually parity in this case, will be favorable to wars. Wars are likely to break out among major powers. These are the powers of the states that realists focus on. Wars are likely to break out among powers whose resources are roughly equal, because in this case, the structure is synonymous with a parity phase or transition phase and no longer with a unipolarity phase. So the power cycle theory, therefore, I think is more logical, more logically coherent. And it is also, I would say, empirically corroborated if we look beyond the different examples that we may give and that I give in our history of international politics class. It is also more, it is also corroborated empirically when we look at the behavior of the past 2 centuries. The behavior of the states, the major powers and the secondary powers. The 19th century is considered to be a multipolar one by balance of power theorists. It is considered to be a unipolar one by balance of power, by power cycle theorists. We saw that the outbreak of World War I was due to the kind of bipolarization of the system. According to balance of power theorists, there was no more shifting alliances because 2 rigid alliances emerged, triple entente versus triple alliance. Let's then look at the composition of these alliances. If we look at the triple entente, it was composed by the French, the British, and the Russians. If the balance of power theory is right, and if states do balance other states' powers, the French and the Russians should not have joined the British, since the British at that time was the most powerful state of the 3. They should have joined a counter-British alliance, which is not the case. The same thing happened after 1945. In 1945, the US was by far the major power thanks to its victory in World War II. If the balance of power theory is right, the European states should have joined the USSR in order to rebalance the system. Did they balance? Did they do that? No. They actually joined the American alliance, or they asked America to create an alliance, Northern Treaty Organization, to balance the USSR, which actually was not more powerful. What does that mean? This means that the secondary powers of Europe joined the prevailing power. Why? Because they were satisfied with the order that the Americans proposed. And this, last but not least, yes, this is what happened after the end of the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, Kenneth Waltz wrote an article, not in this book, of course, but it is Kenneth Waltz, The Emerging Structure of International Politics, 1993, The Emerging Structure. And he expected Germany and Japan to balance the US. Did Germany and Japan balance the US? No, they remain close allies to the US, at least up to now. That is to say, 27 years after this prediction was made. In other words, the secondary powers since the end of the Cold War go on being loyal to the prevailing hegemonic power, US, because they are satisfied powers, satisfied with the American established unipolar order. So the prevailing peace, ladies and gentlemen, is my last argument, prevailing peace or the prevailing stability since 45, throughout the 19th century, and all the more so since the end of the Cold War, is due to unipolarity. The prevailing peace is due to polarity. This will be the last claim in the first part, ladies and gentlemen, of these lectures on theories of war and peace. We up to now saw theories of war. We will come from next lecture onwards to the theories that focus first and foremost on peace and deduce the risk of war from their analysis of the possibilities of peace. And maybe we will see in our very first class next week that the contemporary peace can be ascribed to other factors than to the unipolar structure of the contemporary era. So be patient, ladies and gentlemen, and wait until next week to have this other argument. Thank you very much for listening to me to today's class. I wish you a great day, and I hope you come back next week. Bye.